Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So today I want to discuss migrating virtual machines in VirtualBox to LXD containers. There used to be a utility called LXD-P2C to perform physical to virtual migrations in LXD. There is now a newer LXD utility that is called lxd-migrate, and it's designed to transition physical machines or virtual machines to LXD. So we're going to learn how to migrate a VirtualBox virtual machine to a LXD container using that lxd-migrate utility. So here we are on a VirtualBox instance of Ubuntu 20.04 LTS, as you can see here. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to be moving this VirtualBox virtual machine over to LXD, and we're going to move it to LXD as a container. Because after all, it wouldn't be a challenge if we simply just moved this virtual machine over to a LXD virtual machine. So we want a challenge. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run off to the Firefox web browser. And here we are at my favorite site, and it should be yours, the Scotti-BYTE website. And now we're going to go off to a GitHub page. So this GitHub page for Canonical is the LXD releases page. So depending upon the version that your LXD server that you have running is, and it probably will be version 5 if you've installed it lately or kept it updated, it'll be 5 point something. Common versions are 5.01, 02. 5.16 is the absolute latest. You want to be able to get a version that corresponds to that version number, more or less. I think that this utility we're going to get, if it's 5.02 and you've got the version 5.1016, not a big deal. All right, so as we scroll down this page, eventually we get to a section that says Assets. And under Assets, we want to download the bin.linux.lxd-migrate. So we click on that, and that goes ahead and downloads it to the download folder. So now we're done with that particular page. If we go over to the downloads folder, and we right-click on the migrate program, we're going to go over to permissions, and we're going to say allow executing as a program, which basically turns on the execute bit so we can run this thing from the command line. Next, I've brought a terminal up here, and I'm going to cd into the downloads folder, and if we do an ls, there's the bin.linux.lxd-migrate program. To execute the program, what we want to do is say sudo / and then the name of the program. We type in our sudo password, and the first thing that we're going to be prompted for is a URL for the LXD server we want to go to. And that's going to be HTTPS. And if you're wondering why the S, it's because we're going to provide a temporary certificate which will be able to do SSL. And then you're going to say / and the address of your LXD server. So in my case, that's going to be 172.16.1.225. And then after that, you're going to put a colon and probably port number 8443. When you did your LXD config, when you first set up your LXD server, it asked you if you wanted to be able to communicate to that server externally And in my videos, I always say answer that yes, and the default port for communication is 8443, and that's why we have the 8443 here. So now we hit enter, and it asks if you want to accept the certificate fingerprint. The correct answer is yes. And then it says, it gives you three choices for what type of authorization we want for that SSL. And the answer we're going to choose is going to be number 3, which is generating a temporary TLS authentication certificate. So I do that, and then I want to come over here and I want to grab this certificate, and I'm going to do a right click and copy. Now I want to add this certificate to the LXD host, so I have a terminal here, which is a terminal on the LXD host, and I'm going to do a nano certificate. I'll just call it certificate.crt. I think I may have a file out there that looks like that, but I'm going to clear the contents of that file out, and I'm going to paste what we just put in the cut buffer. Then I'll do a Control-O, hit enter to write the file out, and a Control-X to exit the editor. And like it says down here on the routine that we're actually running on the virtual machine, it says to do a lxc config trust add, and then the name of our certificate file, which is going to be certificate.crt. And now it says there's no such file, and that's probably because I spelled this thing wrong, but this always happens on live videos. So we want certificate. There we go. So that time it loaded the certificate file correctly. So this is probably a really good point in time to mention the fact that this lxd-migrate will of course only work on a Linux virtual machine and say not a Windows virtual machine, but it should work on a variety of different Linux machines. So I'm using Ubuntu here because it's a simple case example of that. And it will go ahead and allow us to do this migrate. So the next question is, would you like to use a trust password? And you can say no, because we don't really need that. And it says press enter after the certificate was added to the remote server. So that's what that other terminal was. When we brought that up, we added that certificate. So now I hit enter, and it says, would you like to create a container or virtual machine? Well, if we say virtual machine, it'll go ahead and create a LXD virtual machine, which is fine. That'll work perfectly, except that I want to do the more complex thing. I want to create a container, and the reason I want to do that is because containers are lighter weight and a little bit more interesting for this exercise. You also notice that it came back and said my host name is Mondo, and it said my version number of my LXD server was 5.1. So now we go ahead and hit enter, and it asks us what the name of our new instance is. This is what we want to call our LXD container. So let's just call this thing migrated. Sounds like a good name, and of course the name is case sensitive, and I put a capital M here, so we'll have to remember that later. Then I hit enter, and it says provide a path to the root file system. Well, the root file system simply at /, which is how we denote where root is. It's possible that your virtual machine may have had its root file system installed in a non-standard location, and that's why we have this prompt. And next thing is, do you want to add additional file system mounts? No, we don't. It's just going to go off and do the root file system, which is on the main disk, and that's probably the use case for most virtual machines. And then finally, we have a number of choices here. We're just going to choose choice number 1, which is begin the migration with the above configuration. So what this starts to do is, as you can see, it is migrating the data from this virtual machine over to our LXD container. So now that the migration is completed, it's worth mentioning that there's one major difference between virtual machines and LXD containers. And that is that a virtual machine, just like a physical machine, has hardware. It's just that in the case of a virtual machine, that hardware is virtual. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up gparted here. And gparted is the GUI version of the partitioning program in Linux. Covered it on the channel before. And here you can see that we have an EFI boot partition, which is normal on modern machines, and it's formatted FAT32. And then we have our root partition, which is SDA2, and it's formatted ext4. So the thing that we migrated was this ext4 partition, and really that's all that's needed. And the reason for that is because the LXD container is not going to have hardware per se. It shares the Linux kernel of the LXD host, and so the EFI partition is actually meaningless in this case. So at this point, we're really done with our VirtualBox virtual machine, and I'm going to go ahead and shut it down with a power off command. Here we are on a terminal on the LXD host, and the first command I'm going to do is a lxc list. And when I do the lxc list command, you can see that there is a container called migrated. It's currently stopped, and that's our container that we've migrated. So if we start this container up, it will get an address on the internal NAT. So rather than do that, what we want to do is we want to give it an address on the LAN, and we're going to do a lxc profile assign to the machine called migrated, if I can spell correctly. And we want to assign it the default profile, which it has by default, but we have to mention it explicitly. And then we're going to add my bridge profile, where I talk about how to build the bridge and the bridge profile over in the LXD step-by-step video. But if you have a LXD server and you followed my videos so far, you should be here, so you should have a bridge profile. So we hit enter on that, and it basically says that default and bridge profile have been applied to migrated. Now we're not going to notice any difference if we do a lxc list. But let's go ahead now and start that container with lxc start migrated. And that will go ahead and make the preparations, which it says it's remapping the container file system. Since we've just migrated it, it won't do that every step from now on. It'll just simply start it, so it'll be faster. And then it started up. So if we clear the screen and we do a lxc list, we're going to see that the container is up and running. If we wait just a couple of minutes and we do another lxc list, we now have an IPv6 address. But as it turns out, it's never going to get an IPv4 address. And that's one of the things that we're going to need to solve in our post-migration. So let's go ahead and connect to that container with a lxc shell migrated. What that'll do is it'll give us a root prompt inside of the container, and now we're able to perform some additional operations. So if we do an if config, you see that ETH0 in fact does have an IPv6 address only because IPv6 is available in my LAN, but there's no IPv4 address. And the device is correctly recognized as ETH0. But what we want to do is we want to go ahead and CD over to /etc/netplan. And when we get there, we can do an ls. And in this case, the file name is called 01 Network Manager YAML. I copy that file name and I go ahead and do a nano on it. And it's a really simplistic file over here, which is kind of what we expected. Since it's a desktop, it's using Network Manager as opposed to Network D, but it really doesn't say anything about the configuration per se. And one thing it doesn't say is it doesn't tell IPv4 to go off and get an address. So I'll do a whole bunch of Control Ks, clear that out, and in the show notes I'll include this very simple netplan YAML file, but as you can see it says DHCP4 set equal to true and track that address by MAC identifier, which is like the simplest version that I can possibly imagine. I go ahead and save this out and exit the editor. At this point, I do a netplan apply, and that will go ahead and run our new routine, and it says that it fails to reload network settings because there's no such file or directory. So we're going to go through a couple of simple things here to try to correct that. One thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do a system daemon reload, and that didn't produce an error, which is a good thing. And hopefully this time we'll do our network or netplan apply and it will work. And it does. Now that we got the netplan to work, I'll just go ahead and do a CD back to the home folder for the root account. I'm going to clear my screen and I'm going to do an ifconfig. And now ifconfig is getting an IPv4 address as we had wanted originally. And in fact, if you go exit back to the LXD host and do a LXC list, you'll see here that that same address is listed for the migrated container. So I'm going to go back into the container again with the LXC shell migrated. And when I get here, I'm going to do an apt install on open SSH-server because I want to have a way to connect to the machine other than connecting to it through the LXC console that we were just using. Now that SSH is installed, we'll do another ifconfig, and we're running at 172.16.1.95. So technically, if I go ahead and exit this console and I do an SSH over to 172.16.1.195, or 95 rather, you would assume that it would be able to make a connection. And we're lucky in this case in that it looks like it might. So I have to go ahead and remove this key because I've used it before, the signature rather, I've used it before, and now we'll try to make that connection again. We'll say yes, and we'll go ahead and type in our password. So I'm logged into a user account, my user account, and it does have sudo privilege. I'm going to go ahead and download this XRDP installer script, which does a whole bunch of nice things in terms of installing Microsoft RDP, which is really great for enabling remote access. So now that I've downloaded the zip file, I want to go ahead and unzip that file with an unzip command. And then we're going to run that routine. So you can't run this as root. You have to run it when you do not have root privilege, and then it will go ahead and prompt for the sudo password. That's just how it works. And when I type for that sudo password, it will go off and install and set all the components required to make RDP work correctly. So now we want to try our RDP connection on our migrated server now that we have the RDP server installed. In order to do that, I went ahead and brought up Linux Remote Desktop Viewer, which is a GNOME tool. I go ahead and click on Connect, and then under my host, I can go ahead and type in 172.16.1.95, and I've also got scaling turned on, and I have my width at 1920 by 1080 because that's the resolution I want with this program. I click Connect, and it gives me a prompt. So I'm going to go ahead and do a view full screen over here, just so we can see it a lot better. I type in my username of Scott, I type in my password, and then it goes off and it connects to the Ubuntu virtual machine. Now notice at the top of the screen it says VBox client, the VirtualBox kernel service is not running. So we're going to bring up a terminal, and we need to perform a couple of operations, and those operations involve removing the VirtualBox guest bits that were installed as a part of using VirtualBox. So in order to do that, we have to do a cd over to /opt, and we get over to OPT, we do an ls. I guess let's make this font a little bit larger. And you see we have this file called VBox Guest Editions. So we're going to cd into that because this thing here is also a folder. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight this and copy it and paste that here, and we cd into that. If we do an ls, you can see that there is an uninstall script, and we're going to go ahead and run that uninstall script, but we're going to have to run that with sudo. So we're going to say sudo and then /uninstall.sh. We're going to provide our sudo password, and it says removing VirtualBox guest additions. So now I'm going to go ahead and cd back to my home directory and clearing my screen. And the next thing I want to do is a sudo apt update, just because that's the best practice to make sure that everything is updated. It should be, because prior to the time when I moved the virtual machine, it was updated over there, and it still is updated over here. So what we have here is a virtual machine that is running, but it's running now in a LXD container. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do a power off and shut this guy completely down. Now that we've gone back to our terminal here, you can see that our SSH connection was actually closed as a result of shutting the machine down. No big surprise. And we do a lxc list, and we're going to notice that migrated, of course, is not currently running. It is stopped. So we're going to do a lxc start on migrated. And it starts immediately because of the fact that it's been started before, but this is kind of our acid test. We want to make sure everything is working correctly. And after a little while, you see that once again it has an IPv6 address. We do another list, and now it has the IPv4 address, and we should be able to come back up here and SSH to 172.16.1.95, and we can go ahead and sign into it. So something else that I think would just be a good thing to do is If we do a cat on /etc/fs tab, this is the file systems table, and it's not really meaningful at this point in time, and this is probably the thing slowing the boot up. And the reason it's not meaningful is because our LXD container, if this is a virtual machine, the mounts would make sense, but in the case of our container, it really doesn't. So I'm going to do a sudo rm on /etc/fs tab, and it will go ahead and remove that file from the system. So there won't be any attempts to do any mounts. Go ahead and exit out of this again, and this time we're going to do lxc stop on migrated. And now we'll go ahead and do lxc list just to verify that migrated is stopped. It is. So after about 2 minutes, we go ahead and do lxc list, and we have an IPv4 and an IPv6 address. Let's go ahead and check those out one more time by doing a SSH to 172.16.1.95 and typing the password, and we're able to SSH into it. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch my RDP client one more time again, and I have my GNOME RDP client over here. If we do an about on it, you can see that it is the remote desktop viewer, and it's we do a connect and we type in 172.16.1.95, and now that we've done that, we can go ahead and click connect, and it says, do you want to accept the signature? Yes, we do. We say continue, and there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and do a view full screen. I'll go ahead and type in my username, and then type in my password, and we should be signed in. And there we go. So what we have here is we have a machine that is running a full up Ubuntu 20.04 desktop that we migrated over from VirtualBox as a VirtualBox virtual machine, but when we migrated it to LXD, we have a simple LXD container. We went ahead and added RDP to it so we'd be able to make a remote terminal connection. So the other thing that you may want to consider is that if you go out to the to a YouTube video or something else that plays sound, you're not going to get sound with this particular configuration. And the reason for that is because you would have to go off and run the installer, and I'm going to do a -H here on the XRDP installer, and the XRDP installer has an option to add sound for XRDP. And so when you installed your RDP, you'd want to go off and do that. The next thing you'd want to do is, of course, you'd want to head over to the Scotti-BYTE YouTube channel, and you'd want to hit the subscribe button, because that would be really important. So in summary, in this presentation, we learned how to convert a VirtualBox VM to a LXD container. LXD containers are much more efficient than virtual machines, which also have to virtualize all of your hardware. The lxd-migrate utility can move both physical Linux machines or Linux virtual machines to LXD containers or to LXD virtual machines. You may have to reconfigure your network in LXD after migration. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.